Open eye, feel the waves cut through me, hypnotized by the sounds I'm breathing in. Hold tight, chemicals collide. Hold tight, hold tight, hold tight. Dripping lights paint the skies, all because of you. Dripping lights paint the skies, only you. So
Good afternoon. The Culp for Governor campaign has breaking news to share with you today. I'm Christopher Gergen, Senior Advisor here at the Culp for Governor campaign. Thank you for joining us. At 1:15 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, the Culp for Governor campaign has filed a lawsuit in King County Superior Court against the Secretary of State asking for injunctive relief and demand for an audit of the paper ballots, vote counting machines, and voting results in King, Clark, Thurston, Pierce, Kitsap, and Skagit Counties. Joining me today to discuss these latest developments is Culp for Governor's attorney, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon. Dr. Pidgeon, how are you?
Well, I'm very good, Chris. Good to talk to you about this particular issue, an issue of extreme significance, I think. And, you know, there's so many things happening now across our nation with the Supreme Court beginning to reach into this particular election, given the improprieties we saw in the four major swing states. But Washington is not out of the woods either. We saw a lot of problems here in this particular election. And our review of this election is starting to surface things that are just, quite frankly, unacceptable. And this is what the lawsuit details. Chris, we started looking at this. A number of people begin to analyze what was actually taking place here in the state. And I suppose if you get overconfident, you tend to get sloppy, and that's exactly what happened. And so there's obligations under our Constitution to manage an election and to manage the election appropriately. And the Constitution calls on the Secretary of State to make sure that the election is being done by people who are the age of 18, people who are United States citizens, people who have been in the state at least 30 days prior to the election, people who are mentally competent, people who are not in prison or suffering from an infamous crime without having their rights restored. So those people cannot vote, and the state has an obligation to determine who can vote and who can't. And so there's protocols. There's protocols that the state always follows. We have, nobody's going out and canvassing the neighborhoods anymore. We use various software services, various online services, and so forth. And the state did not do that. We know that the state did not run the failed ID Act software against their own database prior to the election. And so people were getting duplicate ballots, lots of them. We know that they didn't run an NCOA, a new change of address against the postal records. In fact, they haven't done that for 4 years. So they had 336,000 names on their mailing list that were people who had moved, many of which were undeliverable, but 171,000 of which had moved out of state. So you had people, and nonetheless, and the one that really tops it off is, of course, the voting dead, which we see clear evidence of this. They put out ballots to over 10,000 dead people, and 7,800 of them voted. We had people voting that had birth dates in the 1800s. Sasquatch voted, Cinderella voted.
One of which, Steve, the birth date on the record was 0001. So we got people alive a couple years after Jesus was born, participating in the election. So, Steve, let's unpack this a little bit. So now that the lawsuit has been filed, it's part of the public record. can we unpack, we've been very kind of played a lot of this close to the vest. We didn't want to get out ahead of ourselves on this. We wanted to be patient, to do things right, to be methodical, to triple check things, to make sure that the information that we're putting out is true and is accurate before we actually not only put it into the court of public opinion, but also put it into the actual court systems. So now that it is a part of the public record, can you kind of walk us through and unpack some of this for the folks out there at home?
Sure. Now, this is going to be a little bit different than what you saw in the Dino Rossi lawsuit, back in 2004.
Right.
And the reason being is that we've had a lot of reforms that have happened. There's a lot of things that have changed. So, for instance, we have this Help America Vote Act called HAVA of 2002 that followed the debacle of the Gore Bush election in 2000. There was a lot of criticism of that election, and so Congress adopted an act called HAVA. Well, HAVA has some very particular requirements that are imposed upon the states, requiring the states to meet particular standards. For instance, when you're using voting machines, that are counting ballots, those machines have to be audited, those machines have to be standardized, and they have to be up to a federal standard. And it has to be done for these machines used in this election. Those machines have not been standardized and have not been audited. The only outfit in the country that does it is a group called Pro V&V, and they haven't looked at any of these machines since 2017. But the voting machines, even though I know a lot of people want to talk about what the ripple is going around the country right now, is that the Dominion machines were flipping votes in Michigan and probably in Georgia. They've got algorithms that all show this stuff. That's not what we're looking to here in Washington. What we're saying here in Washington is that the Secretary of State was so sloppy coming into this election that she did not guarantee and did not perfect a free and fair election. And, when you look at the rhetoric of Bush versus Gore, the Supreme Court came down very firmly with the idea that when you diminish a person's vote by allowing a fraudulent voter to vote, that is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment. It's an extremely important point. You have a right to 100% of your vote, not 99 point something or 98 point something. Right. And anytime somebody wrongfully votes, your vote is diminished. And so we had some of the improprieties that we have testimonies to, and these have come from sworn statements, by the way. We have testimony to people, openly filling out ballots, for instance, up in Whatcom County. We have anomalies coming in King County all over the place where votes were at one time counted here and then later they diminished, they went down. I mean, how does that happen unless somebody's making a trip to the dumpster, right? And then you had this anomalous factor where the votes for Biden came in, 86% of the votes for Biden came in a 2-minute period, of time. I mean, that's an interesting counting anomaly. We had an issue where the governor declared himself the winner before a single vote was counted. I mean, how do you do that? Especially when you haven't campaigned. Well, one way you could do it is if you know what the vote total is going to be before the election ever happens. And even though that's not alleged in the complaint, what is alleged in the complaint is this. The civil rights of the Culp for Governor campaign were violated. They were violated because the Secretary of State did not engage in equal protection, instead used sloppy practices. She failed to run the address list against the NCOA from the U.S. Postal Service, which she could have done. And instead, 300,000+ ballots were mailed to people who had moved. She didn't run the death list. She didn't run the list against the master death list. They could have run that before the election and not mailed 10,000 ballots to the dead, but instead they did, and 8,000 people voted. And she didn't run the felon list. There were people in prison that were getting ballots. There were people getting duplicate ballots. The long and the short of it is that we have an election fiasco. And because we have an election fiasco, nobody knows really what the true total is. Nobody knows exactly what happened. And as a consequence, we're asking the court to come in and say, hey, just wait a minute. We're not talking about the federal election. We're not talking about whatever happened to Trump. We're talking about what happened to Lauren Culp and the Culp for Governor campaign. And what we want the court to do is we want the court to say, yeah, you know what? There are some improprieties with this vote. There's enough improprieties with this vote where we can't be sure what we have here. We don't know what we have. It's not a free and fair election. more importantly, it's not a lawful election. One of the most important facts that we have in the complaint has to do with the fact that the Secretary of State ran a Microsoft OS patch on November 21st, 3 days before the vote was certified. Now, that is a direct violation of the HAVA Act, which requires her to preserve and protect 100% of the information that went into the election. She's required to preserve and protect everything, all the ballots, all the information, all the software, all the data feeds, every bit of all the history of the data feeds, all is to be protected under HAVA. She didn't do it. She ran a patch. And in addition to that, another anomaly that we discovered, and this is quite unusual, is that, here we are in the COVID lockdown, right, where we have Governor Inslee, ruling the state by fiat, executive fiat, over 300 executive orders so far, where he just, fishing, okay, fishing, you can come out of your room, you can't, you can have friends over, you can't, whatever it may be, put a mask on your face before you talk to me, this thing. And he ordered at one point, apparently, the National Guard to put the election results on National Guard discrete servers. Now, this is an unusual and outside of the norm deal. And what the case is in front of the U.S. Supreme Court right now, where it sued 4 of the key states, now joined by 17 others, you have a situation going on in the Supreme Court where they're saying, look, the governor changed the protocol. The governor, not the legislature, the governor changed the protocol as to how the vote was going to be handled in the state, which is ultimately going to result in electors being appointed to vote for the president. I know it's a bit complex, but it falls under the 12th Amendment, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And what Texas is saying, what 18 other states are saying is, you can't do that. It's very clear in the U.S. Constitution that the legislature has to establish the protocols for the election, and that is how the electors are picked. And here you had a governor come in and say, we're going to supplant our servers, National Guard servers, rather than using the protocol that's been established by the legislature. Now, if that fact is sustained, this election in Washington is null and void as a federal election, completely null and void as a federal election, and it must be reviewed by the courts here in the state. So we're asking a King County judge, that's correct, we're asking a King County judge to come in and look at this and say, you know what, I'm finding enough improprieties here to where I'm going to order an forensic audit recount of this election. Now, I can tell you from a federal point of view, Chris, it looks like the federal government is going to be doing just such an audited recount in these 4 swing states using the U.S. military. I mean, that's the story that I heard this morning, that they're probably going to be deploying the U.S. military to go in and review every ballot, review the ballots for improprieties, review the ballots to find out if they, in fact, exist in the database. And in this state, we can do that. And to find out if there have been any inordinately placed ballots or ballots that were filled out later. Now, this is another factor that's not pled in the complaint, but may become viable as part of our action. There's a case in 1997 called Fisher v. Love, a U.S. Supreme Court case, and it was ruled on 9-0 basis that the election takes place on the election day, and it doesn't take place after that. But there are videos showing people creating ballots after midnight and stuffing them into the ballot vault in certain jurisdictions. There's videos of this. Now, if there's any votes whatsoever that take place after midnight, that also has the potential to completely devoid the entire election under the rhetoric of Fisher v. Love.
And one of the reasons, something that we have not gotten into prior to this, that the servers were switched is because of the hacking debacle that started with the Employment Services Department and the
That's
unemployment, where $500 million of taxpayer money went to Nigeria. There was no one held accountable. And there is evidence, strong evidence, that hacking was pervasive, and that it was not just limited to the unemployment department, that it was actually statewide, and that it compromised the servers inside the Secretary of State's office.
That's correct. In fact, the statement that was made inside the Secretary of State's office when Microsoft personnel came in and said, or the IT crew came in and said, we need to do this OS patch. And there were many people that objected and said, you shouldn't be doing any OS patch during the certification process of the vote. But the Secretary of State said, we're going to do it. And the IT personnel said, we need to do it. Why? Because the information is out in the wild.
Quote unquote.
The information is out in the wild. What does that mean? I guess Nigeria had its hand in manipulating the election. Now, this also is important because any foreign influence in the election at all, I mean, that includes any foreign hacking, that includes the ability to do any foreign hacking, for instance, through backdoors in routers that may be Chinese built, or by using systems that were controlled or run by Dominion or other software companies that had already been hacked. Where you have foreign influence, such as Nigerian princes coming in and manipulating data, somebody in Canada manipulating the data, somebody with a server in Germany manipulating the data, all of that has been prohibited by an executive order signed by Donald Trump in 2017. So this, again, is going to be very illustrative of the kinds of problems that we see when you have this kind of slipshod work done by the Secretary of State, who, by the way, Chris, I think you might know this, our Secretary of the State is one of the most popular people on the West Coast, far more popular than Joe Biden, far more popular than Inslee.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things there. The opponent. So Mr. Culp received more Republican votes in this gubernatorial election than any other election prior, and he received almost. He received about 1.75. I'm rounding million votes. Spent a lot of money campaigning. 3.1 million campaigning. The Secretary of State's opponent in this race really didn't run a race. In fact, nobody really even knew who she was. And magically, she receives 1.8 million votes in the election. Mrs. Wyman receives like 2.1 million votes to Inslee's 2.2 million, and she didn't run any sort of statewide campaign. So it's interesting, and that's just one example, Steve, of many. I believe that this may also benefit some of our down ballot guys, and that has really been something that we've done here at the Culp campaign since we won on August 4th, was to help the down ballot guys. When we were doing our rallies across the state, we always made it a point to get our down ballot guys up on the platform to talk to their constituents and to give a little bit of a boost to their campaigns. And there have been several campaigns that were lost by an extremely small margin. And if there was any fraud or impropriety there, I believe it is my contention that there are several elections that we may run across where the outcome that has been certified is not the outcome that actually happened. What say you?
Yeah, that's such an important point. And when you talk about the certification of the election, you're talking about the Secretary of State coming forward and saying, I certify that I have met all the protocols of HAVA, right? The Help America Vote Act, the federal controls, which means that I have all of this data under control. All of my machines have been previously audited by ProV&V or another certified auditing group that's been approved by HAVA, which there isn't any. There's only one. There's only ProV&V, and they haven't done anything since 2017. But she's certifying all this. She's certifying that the records that she sent out did not include convicted felons, did not include people under the age of 18, did not include people that had moved out of the state and had been gone for 30 days prior to the election, did not include the mentally incompetent, did not include people who were not United States citizens. She didn't even run the failed Real ID software against the protocol before she mailed it. So the long and the short of it is you can call it negligence if you want, you can call it slipshod. But the fact is, she did not run a certified election. She did not run a lawful and legal election. She ran an unlawful and illegal election, and one that was marked with enormous numbers of improprieties, that who knows which votes were affected where. All we know is that the count she certified is not an accurate count, and it needs to be recounted.
So in closing, what are the next steps now that this has been filed? What can we expect as we move forward?
Well, I want to encourage, people who are whistleblowers to come forward with what you know. Come forward with what you know. We'll prepare a declaration. We're going to be bringing our motion for a preliminary injunction here, and it's going to be soon. We have, unlike the federal election where you got safe harbor date, that's come and gone. You've got the electorate date coming up here on the 14th. We don't have that. There's nobody coming into office until January. So we have a little bit of room here. But if you're a whistleblower and you have information about people stuffing ballots, people marking ballots, people throwing ballots in the trash, people hauling ballots in, people monkeying with the ballot counting machines, either before or after the election, any of that information, we'll be happy to take it. We'll be happy to prepare a declaration on your behalf, recognize that it's going to be a sworn declaration on oath, and we are going to submit it in the state court. So your name will be known. But the fact is, now is the time. This is the time. We're either going to fight for a free and fair election in Washington now, or we're not. And this is the time. This particular election is the one. So let's stand up and be counted.
Well, I know on behalf of Mr. Culp and the entire Culp for Governor team, we are in it to win it. We are in it for a fight. Regardless of how it turns out, we're going to continue to fight. So we the people have a voice in Washington State, and that we preserve the republic, not the democracy, but the republic that we have here and the freedoms that we all enjoy. So, Steve, thank you very much for joining us today. And on behalf of Culp for Governor and the entire Culp for Governor staff, Mr. Pigeon and his staff, we want to say a Merry Christmas to all of you. And we want all of you to stay tuned to the latest that is going to be coming in the next few days. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.